a little bit here to accommodate COVID-19 and have done so with a lot of grace and a lot of patience. So we really appreciate that, and that all of their studies are connected directly to students with disabilities as well as the classroom. So we will start with Surisa Abraham, who is presenting Promoting Engagement in Shared Book Reading for Children with Autism.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Surisa Abraham, and my action research study was about promoting engagement in shared book reading for children with autism spectrum disorder. Next slide, please. All right. There has been a lack of sufficient support for preschool age children with autism spectrum disorder in shared book reading in the early childhood program. And many of the children with ASD lack verbal, social skills to fully participate and engage in the book reading activities. And many of the children exhibit delays in their receptive and expressive development that make it very a challenge for them to engage with the shared book reading. Next slide, please. All right, the purpose of this action research study was to examine the effects of modified dialectic reading prompts on the level of participation and engagement. This is in the form of either communicative response, verbal or nonverbal response during shared book reading with the parents, parents reading the book and then asking questions, something. Okay, and I was just going to expand on what is a modified dialectic reading prompt. This includes the acronym of CROWD, that means completion, the completion, recall, open-ended question, distancing, and spatial prompts. And spatial prompts that may include like helping the child to answer by asking yes, no questions, or even help pointing to the picture on the book. So the research question in this study was, what is the effect of modified dialectic reading on the verbal and nonverbal participation of preschool age children with ASD during shared book reading? Next slide, please. So there has been the study in this area. In 2013, the researchers, Ferry, Miramonte, Hudson, and Schwartz examined the need for help with joint attention, communication, and social skills for engaging children with ASD during book reading. And later in the year 2016, the researchers also do the study to examine the effect of crowd prompts on the level of verbal participation and vocabulary goal of children with ASD. In the following year, in 2018, the researchers Ferry and Hughes conducted a study about shared book reading between the caregivers and the preschool age children with ASD about book reading, and also to see what can be contributed to the engagement in order to have them fully participate in the shared book reading. So they also do some study about how repeat reading may be beneficial for the sake of predictability and routine for children with ASD. Next slide, please. For the methodology in this study, single case, multiple baseline design across participants was used in this study to see the performance prior to the intervention, during intervention, and after the intervention. In other words, this is the ABA design. And that data was collected on for 3 weeks, 4 times a week. And the data, the setting, this is a very interesting. The setting was in the home of the student with ASD. Parents later reading session, and the researcher, me and myself, do observe over the Zoom conference. Again, this is due to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was not the plan to do this way, but we did it, and I want to show the report what we did here. There were 3 participant children. They are preschool age between 3 to 5 years old, and the student are eligible for education service in the category of autism spectrum disorder, and they have the individualized education plan, and also receive the comprehensive service from the school, from the public unified school district. And then data collection, all sessions are to be recorded, and also researcher review recording after each session to confirm the accuracy of data collection. There are also data sheet about the 10 questions per each book. So the book that we use in this study are 2 children books. One is one of the popular one, the Caterpillar, the very caterpillar, sorry. And then the Peter Cat, I Love My White Shoes. So each book, we post 10 questions. I'm going to show you later. With next slide, please. In the intervention, there are the independent variables. That's the number of questions based on the storybooks. As I mentioned earlier, we have used these 2 books, the Very Hungry Caterpillar and the Peter Cat, I Love My White Shoes. And the question on dialogic reading prompts will be incorporated with the crowd prompts, which means completion, recall, open-ended questions, WH questions, distancing, and spatial prompts. So visual support also included in this study, such as the visual icon, picture, tactile prompting, and then material, even the post-it note. We include that in just to provide it to assist the participation of the student. As for the dependent variable, we are used, that is the frequency of correct verbal and nonverbal response, such as pointing, matching picture, or even eye gaze. We'll look at that. And the way to, and then open the post-it note during the chapbook reading. Next slide, please. Now we have 3 participants. One of the participants here, that's a pseudonym. She's 4 years and 2 months old when we did the study. This is she's a South Asian Indian descent. During the baseline, she remained during the baseline. We have 10 questions for each session. So she remained in the baseline for only 5 reading sessions, and then during that time, she's had difficulty attending. She's like crawling on the couch, and her father read the book to her. And that, well, I was actually really gonna get to this because she's really crawling all over the room and calling on her dad while her dad tried to read. She's over around here. So, but the father has so much patience, and we didn't stop. We continue. She moved forward into the intervention after only 5 sessions of reading as a baseline. And then she engaged more during intervention, be able to answer, even though it's not correct answer, but she did try pointing and pointing, and also saying, use the word approximation. Then we return to baseline. She did not answer reading question correctly all the time, but she was able to remain engaged, and then better than the initial baseline session. So later on, she's able to answer more questions. And then the father shared that the serial progress, and he asked me when we finished that, is there any other book that we can do to do the same type of strategy like this using the cloud prompts. So I was very pleased to hear that. Next slide, please. Now this is the graph show about Wiki. The first one you can see on the far left. That was the baseline, and Wiki only in 5 sessions make progress to the intervention, and then back to baseline. She's making good progress. Next slide, please. And here the second participant is Henry. So Henry dad read a book to Henry. Henry only speak English at home, and the father read the book to him. He was so he'd been exposed to literacy before. His parents read the book to him before. But for this study, Henry only Henry answered questions so well. And then we move Henry to the second day, we move Henry to he ready for the intervention. He's making I would say kind of like a roller coaster. On some day he would answer, on some day he would protest, and really hard to get him to settle in. So that's why the intervention graph looks that way. So there were times that we did it in the kitchen as I observed from Zoom, and he would run outside. Dad had to follow him. So when we get back to the baseline, the last session, Dad decided to have him in the car with the car seat. So he won't run away. And I feel so, I can see the struggling that parents have to go through. All right, next slide, please. The third participant is Alex. So Alex, the Asian Indian descent, Alex about 4 years old. Alex was 4 years old. And Alex's mom read the book to Alex, and she was so excited because she said Alex needs have a difficulty answering questions, even the WH question at home. So after Alex performed well in the first baseline, we move forward to the intervention. Then things happened. Alex mom had to care for the younger brother, which is like two years old. So mom asked the ABA therapist in the home that come and to do service for a couple of hours to do the reading. I observed that, and it turned out to be we had to stop because Alex not talking, not answering. I think that part of that is that because the changing of the person as opposed to mom asking, now have ABA therapists, even if she provide all kind of prompts, but they decide that no, not going to do that. So we have to stop the activity for for a week. Then when we have him back to the last session, he able to answer more, and I request mom to be the person that do the reading. So it shows something about predictability. Routines are very important in this part of the study. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the result indicate that the 3 children maintain high levels of engagement during dialogic reading sessions. But however, we have a limitation of this study, include the limitation of it's due to the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. We're not planning on doing via Zoom conference virtually, but we did it. And the researcher unable to play active role in this session, I become an observer. Yet, although the parents were trained, we trained virtually, and the implication of the future research. Before we get to that, the setting was not a controlled setting, as opposed to the special day classroom that I was planning at the beginning in the classroom of the student. So in the home, there's a lot of distraction, although I didn't see it, but I can see the kids not looking at the book there when the dad's reading and run to get toys, and some distraction of the sibling talking or want to play. So now that part of the limitation. Moving forward, application for future research. I believe that the more study need to be done to experimenting modified diversity reading strategy to share book reading, not just only in the classroom, but should be done at home as well. So in order to get a consistent and then on the same page, parents should, the teacher could train the parent and also use the same book that we use in the classroom. That way that will be more meaningful and help the student understand how this works in the classroom, and it will work the same way at home. That's again consistent and routine. That was the children try for that. And also, I'm going to end with this one that the study is should be in a more controlled environment. As I mentioned earlier, it's in the area that have least least distraction. It will help to get a correct and better data for this type of study. Next slide, please. All right, thank you everyone for listening to my presentation. And I want to thank you to the special education faculty and staff at San Jose State University. And can't forget a big thank you to my supportive family, my husband, our son and our daughter, and also our rabbit. His name is Alfie. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Surisa.
Thank you.
I'm going to try to see if I can minimize this. There we go. All right. So next up, we have Annalisa Dileonardo. Sorry. Let me just make sure. I think I have yours right here, Annalisa.
Yes.
All right. All right. So Annalisa Dileonardo is going to be presenting sensory processing disorder and creative play strategies.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. K. So today I'll be talking to you about sensory processing disorder, or SPD, and creative play strategy. Once again, I'm Annalisa Dileonardo. Next slide, please. So children with sensory challenges, it affects daily life. Their daily life is affected. Play and other aspects are often challenging because the environment is too over or understimulating. They are trying to avoid the environment because it makes them too uncomfortable, or they feel lost in the environment because it does not give them enough input. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this action research study was to explore whether young children with sensory processing disorder have longer play duration when presented with sensory enhancing toys and activities. Young children with SPD have been shown to have challenges with playing or short attention span because the environment is too under or overwhelming. With a more enhancing and sensory pleasing environment, a young child with SPD will have longer play sessions compared to peers of the same age. The research question I was trying to answer throughout this study was, do children with SPD have a longer play duration when presented with sensory enhancing toys? Next slide, please. There was so much research that I would love to share with you, but I'd like to point out a couple key pieces that I talked about in my chapter 5. Play is a crucial part of child development, as we all know. It builds the foundation for life. Benson and his colleagues did a study of how children with sensory processing difficulties and how they play in their natural environment. Quoted, the findings revealed that interplay between the child's underlying sensory processing difficulties and his play skills and behaviors increased in understanding of how a child with sensory processing defects, plays will provide information for other occupational therapies and help in the treatment of children with similar defects. So long story short, this amazing study showed us that these children have a lot of challenges playing when compared to their same age peers, and more research in this study area would benefit all areas in the special education field, including occupational therapists. Another groundbreaking study was by Bunham, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and it was a revolutionary study because he studied about the brain structure of children with sensory processing disorder. He did a study comparing brain structure of those children with sensory processing disorder and those without. Results actually showed that children with sensory processing disorder actually had higher white matter in their brain than those compared to the same age peers. And he was looking at all different kinds of brain imaging, but mostly MRIs. And it was actually really surprising the amount of higher white matter that these children had. And he believed that this led to the challenges that these children and adults face. Next slide, please. For this study, I had 4 amazing participants. I had 2 girls aged 5 and 8 at the time of my study, and 2 boys aged 6 and 8. One of my girls, the 8-year-old, is diagnosed with SPD as well as Dandy-Walker syndrome and spina bifida. And one of my boys, the 6-year-old, is diagnosed with a cognitive impairment and is legally blind. 3 of my participants have Dandy-Walker syndrome as well. And one of the 5-year-old girl, she does receive ABA therapy at home for behavioral challenges. But only one of my participants is officially diagnosed medically with SPD, but all of them show sensory challenges. And all of them, their parents filled out the sensory child profile by Dunn 2014, and all of them scored in and were flagged for sensory processing disorder. I did an action research study with an ABA design, and each phase I had done once. So I did baseline, intervention, and I'd like to show some of my results to you. So these are the results for participant NK, the 8-year-old girl, and what is pretty surprising. And her results from the sensory profile 2 showed that she is a sensory avoider. So she does not like things touching her. She wants to avoid situations because they overwhelm her. And so the intervention gave input. And so what was surprising was the intervention, quote, did not work because it did not lengthen her play duration. But something surprising is if we look at the chart on the right, it shows that although her play duration went down for both from baseline 1 to intervention 1 and baseline 2 to intervention 2, her play ideas increased. So her play was much more age appropriate when the sensory enhanced toys were present. And this was true for all of my 4 participants. Next slide, please. And so this is more results for participant NK. I also, for each participant, tallied their sensory behaviors, whether it be negative, neutral, or positive. As you can see for NK, for baseline 1, she had a lot of negative sensory behaviors, but none in any of the intervention phases. And this was actually really good. And you can see the times that she stopped and played, and the chart I have on the left also decreased. So although she played less, her play duration was more. Next slide, please. So this is for participant TK, NK's sister. And her sensory profile too showed that she is a sensory seeker. And for her, the results showed that the intervention was quite a success. As you can see, although the one on the right kind of looks like a roller coaster, as Surisa said, the chart on the left is a little more easy to read. I combined baseline and intervention 1, and then put the line baseline and intervention 2. And then the bar chart shows the percentage of increase. So as you can see, she kind of skyrocketed her play duration. Next slide, please. And as you can also see, her play duration, her amount of times that she stopped and played also decreased, and so did her sensory behaviors. She had so much more positive sensory behaviors and way less negative sensory behaviors. Now, our next slide, you're going to actually get to witness JS's, some of his play. Now, I would like to remind you, JS is a 6-year-old boy, but he is cognitively impaired as well as has Dandy Walker syndrome and is legally blind. And so throughout this video, you'll get to see baseline and intervention 1. I kind of split and cut some of the video, and if the audio goes a little out, I had to bleep out his name for confidentiality. So I apologize for that, but let's go ahead and watch a little bit of this. Now we're fading into intervention phase. All right, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. Although I would love to show you all the video, and I wish we were able to hear the audio on that. In the first one, he is not fully verbal yet. JSE is working on that. But in the second one, he is actually vocalizing a number of times, and he proudly looks at his dad and says, "Geez," and it's the cutest thing ever. And oh man. But in conclusion, future research, I feel like there's so many things this research study could be a jumping off point for. And I would love if there could be a language component for this, especially if you could do it in a group setting with typically developing peers. That was one of my original ideas, but of course it had to change. And then also looking specifically at the children's play ideas. Like I said before, they all their play ideas grew tremendously and were much more age appropriate when the intervention was in place. And I feel like if we did a research study specifically looking at that and why, I feel like it'd be really cool. Of course, every research study has limitations. Mine, I feel like, were very small sample size with similar participants. I wish I had a more variety, and that would have been awesome. And for me, I felt like time for phases of the study was as not as long as I would have liked. I would have loved to have much more time for each phase, but time I felt was a bit not on my side. Of course, as all of us during this stage, the COVID-19 pandemic threw a monkey wrench for all of us. And then training for my second researcher. My second researcher has research experience, but he's trained in the sciences and not for observing children's play. Although we had many conversations about it, I would have changed in how I did it differently in the future with much more examples. Next slide, please. And I just want to thank all the staff and professors at SJSU. You're all amazing. I know I'm not the easiest. I also want to say thank you to my father, who helped me for countless hours through getting through school in these past 2 years, and my Aunt Elena, who is my amazing help and my editor for my thesis, and on my cohort. You're all amazing, and I love you all, and I'm going to miss you. But you got my number, call me. And I also want to thank all my friends supporting me for these past 2 years while I've been missing in action, and of course, my world's best guide dog, Walton. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always open to chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Annalisa. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move over to Joanna. Let me see if I have the right slide here. Nope. I think this is the one. There we go. All right. We're going to go ahead and move into Joanna Gaeta, which is looking at discipline disparities of male minorities in special education, effects of perceptions, school-imposed labels, and behavior-based referrals.
Thank you, Dr. K. Hello, my name is Joanna Gaeta, and this is the action study that I did for my research. And this study, just like many of the people in our cohort, it started out in one way and then it kind of evolved. To share the premise of where I got the idea to start this study. I am a middle school special needs teacher in the mild moderate setting, and something that I was noticing when I was in my credential program is how the school administrator would deal with disciplinary matters when it came to students with special needs. And oftentimes I noticed that when I would look back to I call them behavior artifacts, but they're just referrals. Within our system, we could see, what was the category that this behavior fell under, where did it occur, what was the setting within the school, and then who was the teacher who reported it, just a little excerpt with some information, and then what was the resolution. And I noticed that with our male minority students with special needs, more times than not, they were dealt they had consequences that were of more magnitude. So they included things like being suspended, being expelled, being in the in-house suspension room. And in my study, I refer to that as exclusionary forms of discipline. And you'll see that that is also a term that's used within some of the literature that I present to you guys. We can go to the next slide, please, Dr. K. which is going to be the statement of the problem. So some of the things I was noticing is that there's something called the discipline gap. In education, we are familiar with the achievement gap where, students are affected by a myriad of aspects within their education that might affect where they land within their academic achievement. Well, on the same coin, there's also the discipline gap. And what I was finding is that it's enabled by teacher, administrator, and staff biases. What I found is, in addition to that, is that these biases have academic, social, emotional, and behavioral ramifications for students with disabilities, and specifically with our marginalized group of male minority students with disabilities. The discipline gap affects the achievement gap and is often discussed as being one of two common forces that result in disproportionality within special education. And I just wanted to add a little quick note here. The reason why I actually included this last point is because when our students are required, or they're given this consequence of being in the in-house suspension room, or they are suspended and required to go home, or they're expelled, this also affects the achievement gap in that our students are not receiving an equitable education. They don't have access to a homeroom teacher, right? They don't have that support that they normally would within the classroom. We can go to the next slide. So based on these things that I was seeing from some of the articles I was reading and my observations, I wanted to pursue this purpose for my study, which is an action study that was seeking to examine how behavior-based referrals impact male minority students with disabilities. And my research question, I originally had two, but as you've heard, we've had to make accommodations and be very flexible with COVID-19. I ended up only focusing on one research question, which is how are male students with disabilities affected by exclusionary forms of discipline? All right. So just to review some of the key pieces of literature that I thought were crucial to this study were Cannon et al., which was a 2018 study. This was a review of research that actually addressed the social constructs that coincided with disability to collectively affect youths and young adults' educational experiences within the school setting. EE et al. 2015 examined the ways that race, risk of being identified as having a disability, and patterns of school discipline affect disproportionality. And lastly, Anima 2016 study researched the ways that disproportionality is a direct effect from society innately criminalizing unwanted bodies, especially females with disabilities. And just a little note on this last point, I really liked the Anima story, the study, and I know that it focuses on the population of females with disabilities. So I wanted to try and take what they did in their study, so I could try and replicate it with mine, but only focus on males with disabilities. Okay, for my methodology, minority participant with special needs. Originally, I actually had 3 prospective participants, but then I for sure had 2 that committed, 1 that ended up dropping out, and then lastly, my final participant that I had the most data for. And this is where my study really focuses on this one student. He is a student with special needs. He is a 13-year-old who identifies as Latino and has an active IEP where he receives services in the area of instruction for 4 SAI periods. The way that I collected data was through pre-interviews. I also had, which is not referenced here, but I actually had a checklist to qualify my participants. Behavior artifacts, which are referrals, they include information such as behavior, category, setting, number of referrals, details, and the resolution for the consequence. I was not able to conduct my focus groups, but I do want to include that within my study, just because in the end, I'm going to talk about how I want this action study to be replicated, and I want the purpose of the study to be used in the way that whatever data we collect from our students, it could be a PD where we actually empower our students. So I was not obviously able to do that, but that is my hope for this study. And lastly, I analyzed the data using in vivo process and values coding. And I selected these in an effort to preserve my participants' voices, since they are marginalized and a lot of times they are, they fall through the cracks, excuse me. I also wanted a way of monitoring the discipline process that male minority students with disabilities face at school. And I also wanted to accurately present the participants' experiences that developed from their experiences with exclusionary forms of discipline. And for the next slide, this is actually just an example of what the behavior artifacts look like. So you could see their referral artifacts, the referral title, amount, location, and then the resolution type. For the results, as I stated before, these were the different coding that I used to analyze my data. And from that, I saw that three major themes were starting to develop from the study, which were challenges posed by consequences, cultivating communication between the school community stakeholders, our students, staff, families, and cultivating care. I also said that supporting initiatives that address staff biases and exhibiting student experiences with exclusionary forms of discipline is a way that can not only address and eradicate the disease of disproportionality, but empower our students in using their voices and experiences when advocating for change and equity within our schools. So this is where I really I was hoping that I would be able to use the student data to somehow create a PD for our school and actually have them share, whether it's they record it to meet their individual needs, or they could do it in person. So that was my original vision for this study. We can go to the next slide, which is conclusions. Oh, yes. So these were the three major themes that resulted from my research. And some of the things that I found were these challenges that were posed by consequences. They manifested on two levels for my student participant, which were physical and emotional. And one of the things he actually shared in an interview was when a teacher gave him a writing assignment, which was his consequence, that those very archaic consequences where I will not, I will not, I will not. He had to write over and over. He talked about how it actually hurt his hand, and he felt that guilt was in his entire body. So this is something that I thought was very telling, is how these challenges or how the consequence resulted in him feeling the impact on these two levels. He also talked about isolation from the rest of the school population, not being able to be with his peers, and being under, being watched by another, by either a teacher or an administrator. And then there was also challenges between the teacher and student in escalated situations. I did a tally between all of the teachers who actually wrote referrals for the student, and there was one teacher who wrote the most referrals for him. My next area was cultivating communication between our stakeholders within the school community. And what I found is that in heightened emotional states, students may need a reset and can often be triggered by incessant questions or which can result in inappropriate reactions. And this is directly tying into some of the challenges that were noted between the student and teacher in the escalated situations. And my last theme, it was in the area of cultivating care. This is really crucial in meeting our students' needs, as well as assessing their well-being. When we have open communication, it should be grounded in caring relationships, because this is actually an avenue that we can address, that can be addressed when bringing awareness to individual staff member biases. So just taking that extra step of actually opening up the channel of communication and creating caring relationships can actually be beneficial for our students. And that was also something that I found within the literature that I was reviewing for my study. For Future research. Research from this study demonstrated that exclusionary forms of discipline affected male minority students with disabilities by creating the challenges of negative physical, emotional, and social affects. This often resulted in a negative impact to the student's educational progress that led to messing around behaviors, resulting in disciplinary actions, initiating an apathetic, negative perspective towards school rules and authority. And this again, this is also echoed within the research that is actually out there, which is when students are, constantly experiencing and receiving exclusionary forms of discipline, there isn't a buy-in, and they start to feel like they are being, like they have a negative perspective towards school and authority, and there's just this disconnect. Some of the limitations that I faced with this study was the COVID-19 pandemic, as you guys have heard. We all face this. And specifically obtaining all the data that I originally planned to from the activities that I wanted to for my study. New themes could have evolved, and I could have had more data to cross-analyze, which would have been really interesting, and that was my hope. So I just want to say thank you to my advisor, Dr. K, for her constantly supporting me and guiding me through this process and through the past few years. I thank Dr. Andy. She actually was with me for the first semester as well, and Dr. Simpson and the faculty at San Jose State University who have imparted within me what it means to be an educator. I also want to thank my Tia Vida, my Tia Loisa. They are strong women within my life who are actually like my mom. They encouraged me through the difficult times and were there for me. And lastly, I'd like to thank my sister Bernadette for believing in me and praying for me.
Thank you, Joanna. All right. If we do get a little warning from Brian, because I know we're over time a little bit, I will try to keep us open. I think I have that ability as the co-host or something, so I'll see what I can do. But I think we're okay. Next we have Chloe, who I think I have you. Let's see. Oop, I'm like scrolling through all my slides here. All right, here we go. I got it. All right. So next we have Chloe, and Chloe is going to be presenting on emotional recognition of individuals with autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so to begin, the statement of the problem and the reason why I looked into this topic was compared to their neurotypical peers, individuals with ASD or autism spectrum disorder have a harder time recognizing the emotions of others, and this impacts their participation in social situations and interactions with others, which in turn leads to negative outcomes and an even greater deficit in certain emotional and social functions. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this study was to use an intervention to assess the emotion recognition skills of children with autism spectrum disorder. And that was in order to answer the question, are individuals with ASD able to recognize emotions faster and more accurately when shown pictures of cartoon faces or real human faces? Next slide, please. Hold on. Oops. Sorry, the text was like blocked. So looking at the literature, according to Smith and colleagues, individuals with ASD prefer cartoon faces and perceive them to be more realistic due to their exaggerated expressions. So for example, cartoons often have bigger eyes, wider mouths, and more intensified reactions. And also, individuals with ASD tend to focus more on off regions or regions outside of the eyes and mouth, which leads to them being slower in recognizing facial expressions and making more errors overall. Next slide, please. So my participants included one 13-year-old male who has ASD, has difficulty socializing with others, has not mastered emotion recognition, and has deviant gaze. So the way that I collected my data is I used a table that consists of the participant's identification number, the session number, number of correct responses in 1 minute, and number of incorrect responses in 1 minute. And this study used a single subject alternating treatment design and will include baseline, 2 treatments, treatment 1, which is human faces, and treatment 2, which is cartoon faces, and then a replication phase. Next slide, please. So this is an example of my data collection sheet, and as stated on the last slide, it has the participant identification number, the session number, number of correct responses and incorrect responses, and then the time taken. Next slide, please. So to analyze this single subject alternating treatment design, participant responses were graphed over time and the number of correct responses were examined. This allows the researcher, me, to see whether feedback given was more effective in helping participants be able to recognize emotions faster and more accurately when shown pictures of human faces or cartoon faces. Next slide. So the results, first looking at speed or time taken, the participant was faster at responding in treatment 1, human faces, than in treatment 2, cartoon faces. And then as seen in the graph, when given feedback during the 2 treatments, the time taken decreased significantly from baseline to the replication phase. And that actually goes against what was stated in the literature, because in the literature, it was stated that they'd have an easier time and be faster with cartoon faces, but my participant was faster with human faces. Next slide, please. And so similar to time taken when looking at accuracy, although the number of correct responses are comparable, the participant performed slightly better in treatment 1, human faces, than treatment 2, cartoon faces. And then when given feedback in treatment 1 and treatment 2, the participant's accuracy improved significantly from baseline to the replication phase. So once again, that goes against the literature that my participant had an easier time recognizing emotions when shown human faces than cartoon faces. Next slide, please. And so results continued. When breaking it down by the 6 primary emotions, the participant had the most difficulty distinguishing between pictures of disgust, fear, and surprise. And so here are some examples of pictures that I used. And I think the reason why my participant struggled so much with those is because they all look very similar and that it's wide eyes and open mouths. Next slide, please. So conclusions, implications, and limitations. So some implications of this work for future studies are that feedback is necessary in helping individuals with ASD recognize emotions faster and more accurately. And then as for limitations, the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, I only had 1 participant, so I didn't have any other results to compare to. And since the participant was a male and was a teenager, I would have liked to have had a participant that was female and not a teenager to see if the results differed. And then I had no inter-observer agreement to make sure all the steps of the study were followed properly. And along with that, the participant did not want his face to be shown. So I was unable to track his gaze and see where he looked, like on the faces of the cartoon and the human pictures. Next slide, please. And then finally, individuals with ASD are able to recognize emotions, but it may take them longer than those that are neurotypical. And providing feedback during emotion recognition tests can help aid in overall accuracy and speed. And overall, increased ability to recognize facial expressions is important for individuals with ASD, and that it helps them understand emotions better and be able to relate to others in social situations. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I just want to say thank you to my family, friends, teachers, and classmates. I could not have done this without you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. All right, we have one last presenter, which is Maria. And Maria is talking about paraeducators' knowledge of and training needs for effective AAC implementation.
Thank you. We can go to the next one. So the statement of the problem, students that are nonverbal or have limited speech are oftentimes unable to express their needs and wants because they have not had enough opportunities with AAC. AAC is alternative and augmentative communication. My action research study explored the effectiveness of AAC and paraeducators' views and trainings on AAC. Next slide, please. The purpose of the study. The purpose of this action research study is to explore the knowledge that paraeducators have in special education classrooms about the use of AAC devices. This research study will help answer the following questions. First, what are the views that paraeducators have towards the use of AAC systems with students who are nonverbal or who have limited language abilities? Second, do paraeducators report they feel adequately equipped to communicate with students using AAC systems? Next slide, please. So the literature of the effectiveness of AAC, Douglas and Light and McNaughton examined the effects of training paraeducators as communicative partners to children with complex communicative needs. Paraeducators were trained in providing the child with opportunities to communicate. Training given to paraeducators increased the number of opportunities for children to communicate, and that the child increases the number of turns to communicate. Accordingly, appropriate training for paraeducators that includes an understanding of the relationship between communication and problem behavior would have a positive effect on paraeducators' views towards the use of AAC devices. Next slide, please. Another study by Sennett, Light, and McNaughton compared the use of AAC to learning Spanish. Just as we would expect a child who is learning Spanish to be immersed in the environment that uses the Spanish language, we would expect a child that uses AAC to be immersed in the environment that uses AAC systems. Next slide, please. So the method, this study took place in my classroom with two paraeducators that work with two limited speech students. And I did surveys, interviews, and observations. It was a total of 10 observations that were throughout the day. So that took 30 to 45 minutes per observation. The surveys and interviews provided a view of the paraeducators' perceptions, while the observations allowed me to identify the challenges the paraeducators face when implementing or not implementing the appropriate use of AAC systems. Next slide. This is a quote from one of my paraeducators when I interviewed her. She said, "The use of AAC device is helpful, but it doesn't work with our students, especially right now that we are in distance learning. When we were in the classroom, we had more control over the students. Using the talker like this, it doesn't work." So she doesn't believe that using the AAC works, especially in a different environment. Next slide, please. The results. AAC devices are not seen as the student's voice, but rather as a tool they only need to use in speech sessions. Paraeducators report that they believe in the importance of the AAC device for our students, but they don't expect the student to use them. They don't request for them to use it. So after 2 hours of AAC training, both paraeducators reported to feel somewhat prepared to communicate with students using AAC. But when observed, one paraeducator oftentimes interrupted students and did not allow for the message to be delivered. Next slide, please. AAC and communication opportunities are important for students with disabilities because it allows them to actively participate in conversations and discussions. Not only is AAC a communication opportunity important for academic needs, but it also to build relationships, live independently, and to participate and contribute to society. AAC allows students to show the world who they are, what they need, how they feel, and what they want. Next slide, please. Conclusions. Findings for this study suggest that students that use AAC devices are often not given the opportunity to participate in discussions with AAC. Students were not encouraged to use their AAC device and provide response, ask a question, or make a comment because their communication partners do not have the necessary training. The limitations in this study include small sample size. I only had 2 paraeducators. The study took place during COVID, so students and paraeducators were in different environments, and It caused more distractions when messages were trying to be delivered and data collection. The implications of this work for future studies indicate a need for more research on paraeducators' roles as communication partners to students with AAC. If paraeducators are not viewed as communication partners, they are not given the necessary resources or training. Next slide, please. And thank you. So I would like to thank the San Jose State University faculty, Dr. Kay, Dr. Simpson, and Dr. Christian for their support and guidance through my graduate work. I would also like to thank my husband, Sergio Sanchez, for his support and encouragement, and my 3 kids, Artina, Roberto, and Evelyn, for always understanding my schedule and time constraints. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. So a big hand to all of our presenters. So just as a reminder for any family or friends who are out there, the graduation is coming up on the 28th of May, and we have our celebration with the Lurie College at 4 p.m. And so that's the virtual graduation celebration. And so all of these folks will be participating. And yeah, thank you again to anyone who's attended our session today. I guess now I think we're shifting back and then going into a break, I believe. So you're welcome to jump off and go back into the main session if you want to hang out for a little bit. Thanks to all the students who presented.
You all did amazing. Great job, everyone. Thank you, Dr. K.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.
Kay.
Hey, now we can see everyone.
I know, now the screens are on.
Hi.